When we picture the world of the dinosaurs, we tend to imagine warmth, steamy jungles, fern-covered plains, a hot greenhouse planet baking under a Mesozoic sun. And for the most part, that picture is right. The age of dinosaurs was, on the whole, far warmer than today. But that image has hidden a remarkable truth from us for a very long time. Because the dinosaurs didn't just live in the tropics, they lived everywhere, including the last place you would ever think to look for them, the Arctic, the frozen top of the world. And up there, more than 500 kilometers inside the Arctic Circle, in a world of long polar winters and months of unbroken darkness, there was a predator waiting. A tyrannosaur, a genuine cousin of the king himself, but one shaped by the cold into something all its own. The North Pole, it turns out, had its very own T-Rex. Its name is Nanuqsaurus, and I love that name because it tells you the whole story before we even begin. It comes from the Inupiaq language of the Alaskan Arctic, Nanuk meaning polar bear lizard. The people who live in that frozen world today lent their word for the great white predator of the modern Arctic to the great predator of the ancient Arctic. And it's a fitting tribute, because just like the polar bear, Nanuqsaurus sat right at the top of its frozen food chain. Now, let me tell you how we found it, because it's a wonderful little story of a discovery that was very nearly missed entirely. Back in 2006, a team of paleontologists was digging in a site in northern Alaska called the Prince Creek Formation, and they weren't even looking for a tyrannosaur. They were after a horned dinosaur, a relative of Triceratops, and in the course of that dig, they collected a few unremarkable basketball-sized lumps of rock and brought them back to the museum in Dallas. And then, as happens more often than you'd think in paleontology, those rocks sat there, largely ignored, for years, until someone took a closer look and realized that tucked inside these overlooked lumps were fragments of a skull, the front of a jaw, pieces of the top of the head. And when the researchers, Anthony Fiorillo and Ronald Tykowski, examined them carefully and compared them to other tyrannosaurs, they realized what they were holding. This wasn't the horned dinosaur they'd come for. This was a brand new species of tyrannosaur, a close relative of both T-Rex and its Asian cousin Tarbosaurus, and it had been living at the top of the world. They described and named it in 2014, and the fragments, humble as they were enough to rewrite our picture of where tyrannosaurs could live. Now, here's the first thing that makes Nanuqsaurus so interesting: its size. Because if you're imagining a full-blown 40-foot, 9-ton T-Rex stalking across the tundra, that's not quite it. Nanuqsaurus was small. For a top tyrannosaur, strikingly small. Estimates put it at around 6 meters long, about 20 feet, which makes it roughly half the length of its famous southern cousin. It stood only about 2 meters tall at the hip. In a lineup of the great tyrannosaurs, it would come up to about the knee of a full-grown T-Rex. And I want to be precise here, because this matters for the science. For a while, you might reasonably wonder whether this was just a baby tyrannosaur, a juvenile of some larger species that hadn't finished growing. But the anatomy of the skull bones tells us otherwise. The holotype shows the features of a mature animal, a fully grown adult. So the small size is real. This was not a big tyrannosaur that died young. It was a small tyrannosaur, full stop. Now, in fairness, some additional larger fossil material has since been tentatively assigned to Nanuqsaurus, so there's some ongoing debate about the upper end of its size range. But the core finding holds. This was a genuinely scaled-down tyrant. Which raises the obvious question: why? Why would a member of a lineage famous for producing the largest land predators of all time end up as a comparative dwarf? And the answer is the heart of this whole story, because it's written by the Arctic itself. It comes down to food. specifically the unreliability of food. See, the ancient Arctic was not the frozen desert it is today. The Cretaceous was far warmer, and northern Alaska back then had a climate more like modern Seattle. Cool, seasonal, temperate, but not permanently frozen. There were forests. There were plant-eating dinosaurs in abundance. But there was a catch, and it was a brutal one. The seasons. Because no matter how warm the global climate is, if you live above the Arctic Circle, you cannot escape the fundamental fact of that latitude. For months of the year, the sun essentially does not rise. Months of cold, dark, polar winter. And during that long winter darkness, the whole ecosystem would have contracted. Plants stopped growing, some prey animals may have migrated away, others hunkered down, and the total amount of food available would have plummeted for a significant chunk of every single year. So a predator living up here faced a feast-and-famine existence. Periods of Arctic plenty in the endless summer daylight, followed by long, lean, dark, hungry winters. And in that kind of environment, being enormous is a liability. A giant body is a giant fuel tank that constantly demands filling. A 40-foot, 9-ton T-Rex needs to eat a colossal amount just to keep itself alive. And in a world where the food supply vanishes for months at a time, that much body is a death sentence. So natural selection did what it does. It shrank the animal down to a size that could actually survive the famine. Nanuqsaurus is a masterclass in adaptation. It's a tyrannosaur that traded raw size for survivability. Small enough to make it through the hungry dark, still large enough to be the undisputed apex predator of its world. In the ancient Arctic, the winning move wasn't to be the biggest. It was to be the one that didn't starve. And the cold shaped more than just its size. Because here's a detail I find genuinely wonderful. Nanuqsaurus was very probably feathered. Now, we increasingly think many tyrannosaurs had at least some feathery covering. But for an animal living through Arctic winters, a thick, shaggy coat of insulating feathers wouldn't have been a luxury. It would have been essential. So I want you to update your mental image one more time. Forget the scaly green movie monster. Picture instead a compact, powerful, 20-foot predator wrapped in a dense coat of shaggy feathers, its breath fogging in the freezing polar air, hunting beneath the shifting green curtain of the northern lights. It's one of the most striking images in all of paleontology, and it's very likely close to the truth. Now, what was it hunting up there in the dark? Nanuqsaurus shared its world with a whole cast of polar dinosaurs, most of them also found in the Prince Creek Formation. There were herds of Pachyrhinosaurus, big, horned, triceratops-like plant eaters with a distinctive bony boss on the snout instead of a horn. And these were almost certainly a key food source. There were duck-billed hadrosaurs in great numbers, well suited to the seasonal plant growth. And there was a fascinating rival, a raptor-like predator called Troodon. And here the Arctic served up another twist, because in Alaska, Troodon grew larger than its relatives elsewhere, possibly because its huge eyes gave it an edge in the low light of the polar winter, letting it hunt effectively in the gloom that would have hampered others. So Nanuqsaurus and this oversized Troodon likely divided the world between them, perhaps one ruling the day, the other the long twilight, an elegant partitioning of a difficult land. And here's the broader point. the thing that makes Nanuqsaurus more than just a fun oddity. Because for a long time, we assumed dinosaurs were fundamentally tropical creatures, that the poles were beyond them. Nanuqsaurus, along with the whole Prince Creek ecosystem, blew that idea apart. It proved that dinosaurs weren't just surviving at the poles, scraping by at the edge of the possible. They were thriving there. They had built a complete, complex, functioning ecosystem. Top predators, herbivore herds, rival hunters, the works, in one of the most challenging environments on the planet, complete with months of darkness and winter cold. It tells us these animals were far more adaptable, far more resilient, and far more interesting than the old lumbering swamp monster stereotype ever allowed. They could handle the Arctic. And they didn't just handle it, they made it their kingdom. So the frozen top of the world, the last place you'd ever go looking for a dinosaur, turns out to have had its own royal court, its own herds, its own hunters, and its own crowned king. A shaggy, feathered, polar bear named Tyrant, half the size of its famous cousin, but every bit as much the master of its domain. The North Pole really did have its very own T-Rex. It was just smart enough and tough enough to be built for the cold. And I think there's something almost poetic in that name. Nanuqsaurus, the polar bear lizard. Two great white world predators separated by nearly 70 million years, ruling the very same frozen ground. The Arctic has always demanded the same things of its kings: endurance, adaptability, and the strength to survive the long dark. Nanuqsaurus had all three. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep looking up.